Well, thank you all so much for being here. If you don't mind, I'll probably kind of move from behind the podium out to the stage. So Becca, I'm sorry if you have to follow me back there with the phone. So again, thanks so much for being here today, guys. This is a really exciting topic for me. I hope you find it so as well. Because electric vehicles are everywhere in the news lately. This is a very topical subject matter for us. But instead of talking about the Teslas and the Rivians and all the other things you might be hearing about, or seeing on the news, I want to go back in time a little bit to the late 19th century and talk about the very first electric cars. Like I said, 100 years before we've had sort of this resurgence, just the last few years. So I started off here with a great photo from our archival collection. This is a Studebaker electric commercial truck here. You can see they're testing its strength by putting an elephant with an injured foot on the back of the truck. I like to think that the elephant recovered from this. I don't know the state of the injury, but there you have, again, this great photo from the early 1900s, so 1910 to be exact. All right, so we'll jump right in here. So I've just divided into three parts for us. We're going to kind of start in 1895 at the very dawn of the automobile age. I have this dramatic lightning picture here. There was a great cartoon I found from the early 1900s talking about the advent of electricity and it becoming such an important part of people's lives. And so I took that coming lightning age from that cartoon. I thought that was appropriate. So, all right, here's another great cartoon, very dramatic. The title of this is called The Unrestrained Demon. So before we get into the history of the electric car, I think talking a bit about the origins of electricity, again, as a service, is important. And so I love this so much, right? I mean, there were a lot of naysayers and folks who were uncomfortable with electricity early in the day. Again, this is the 1880s, I believe. And you can see this great spider with a light bulb on its back, skull head crawling through this maze of electrical lines. And you would have seen a lot of these lines strung up in major cities around the country, again, 1880s onwards. But again, it's terrifying, it's going to electrocute you. And there were a lot of unsafe elements to early electric systems. But I think this is being a little bit dramatic. There were electric linemen who did die. I mean, they're working on, high voltage wires when they didn't fully understand what they were doing early on. And people did die, but again, the dead horse in the background really puts it home for you. So. All right, so again, talking about electrifying America. The idea of this war of the currents, you may have seen or heard of this before. So we have Thomas Edison and Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla all introducing their own sort of versions of how to deliver electric power. You've probably heard of AC and DC and whatnot. So back in the 1880s, we see a lot of these systems being installed. New York City was one of the first major cities to have local power stations that Edison installed with DC current and transmission lines in major cities. So some of the first electric technologies you would have seen are streetlights, electric trolleys, and then eventually electric appliances for the home. So here's a few photos. This top one I love. This is an image from the Library of Congress. It's a scene of the agriculture building at the Columbian Exposition in 1893. So folks would have been exposed to the wonders of electricity. Again, by the early 1890s, it was all lit up, powered by one of Edison. I think actually Westinghouse powered the World's Fair. So. Here's an electric trolley in Tacoma, Washington. Again, these systems would have been in many major cities by the late 1800s. They were powered by lines, again, running up and down the street. So, and then here's a power substation from Commonwealth Edison in Chicago. So, another great photo, just to kind of again hammer home this idea. Actually, one photo, one illustration. The one on the left is a street in New York City. Prior to 1888, most of the electric lines were suspended above the streets going into homes and stores, you name it. It was very unsightly and quite dangerous. There was a blizzard, I think in 1888, in New York City and the East Coast that effectively shut down the East Coast for several days. Many people died from the weather, but also electric lines falling onto the street. You can imagine just like arcing, throwing sparks everywhere. That wasn't ideal. And so that's when New York City and other cities decided to bury their power lines. And so this is the same street 20 years later. And this is also the period when cities like Boston and New York installed their subway system underground. This is a big photo. It's going to take a second to move on. There we go. All right, so we're getting into, again, electricity is normal. People are using it every day. It can be dangerous, but it's transforming everyday life, right? And so now we get the first automobiles kind of making their appearance in major cities. So we have a few cartoons from papers we have here. So this first one is, I love that. It's the horseless carriage literally barreling down on a horse. I believe that's from 1899. And you see very similar cartoons and other illustrations in other newspapers. This image in the center, again, just to kind of give you a sense of if you were standing on a city street around 1899, 1900, you could see many different forms of transportation, from those electric, I have a laser pointer here, electric trolleys to horse-drawn carts. I don't think there's any automobiles in this picture, but again, depending on where you were, you would see all sorts of different stuff. Here's another article from a Cincinnati newspaper called the Commercial Gazette. Again, this is that's August 8th, 1899, talking about the first experimental drive of this newfangled electric vehicle, right? And so my favorite quote from this article is this one right here. "The test was made without an accident, and only one horse took fright at the horseless vehicle." All right. So you see these kind of articles all over the place. And it mentions in here this is the first such test in a city like Cincinnati. There would have been similar tests in the years prior on the East Coast where a lot of these things originated, or in Chicago. All right, so we can't really talk about the electric car without talking about the battery. We hear a lot about that today too. So I mentioned these electric streetcars and trolleys. Obviously those systems were helpful and again, in congested cities, helped a lot with mass transit. But these early wired transportation systems had obvious limitations. If you weren't going uptown to downtown, you would have to connect to a different system or take a different vehicle. So batteries were the answer, and batteries were not a new technology in the 1890s, but they had certainly come a long way. So you're probably all familiar with lead acid batteries. We still use them in a lot of applications. They're still very heavy, and require maintenance even more so back in the day. But they could produce large currents, and they were rechargeable, which is an important point that we'll get to in a minute here. Lead acid wasn't the only technology for batteries. I know that Thomas Edison invented nickel iron batteries, a type of alkaline battery. You can see him here standing next to one of his electrics. Yeah, they were a little bit lighter, had better charging capacity, but they had their own issues that we'll look at in just a second. All right, so again, kind of closing the book here on this transition from horse-drawn carriages and horse-drawn vehicles to cars. Again, three very interesting photos here, and that headline from the Chicago Tribune. Is the automobile mania a form of insanity? Maybe, I don't know. But there was a lot of conversation and worry about how horses would react to these machines that were all of a sudden appearing on city streets. Electrics, well, I'll get into that more in a second. But yeah, this photo, I think, or this little illustration is great. Like, let's try and appease the horses by just sticking a horse head onto an electric car. Another great illustration, this actually is very close to where I used to live in Hyde Park in Chicago. This is the museum, what is now the Museum of Science and Industry. Lakeshore Drive would be right over here. You can see two early automobiles and then a carriage being pulled by a horse there. So, and this is another early electric vehicle from the 1880s. So, a lot going on at this point. And I should mention too, in Chicago was one of the first cities to institute laws around regulating automobiles. I think they set an 8-mile-per-hour speed limit in 1900. So if you went past that, you were in trouble. So. All right, so that's kind of part one. Again, we're transitioning into the automobile age. We do have electric vehicles are making great strides. There are some early experimental gasoline-powered vehicles and also steam-powered vehicles, so I'll get into that in just a minute. So now we're here at 1901. All right, so I mentioned electricity, and I like to use this term motive force. So there's, in essence, three motive forces, right? So electricity, again, what we're focusing on here today, I have two advertisements, or an advertisement and a piece of sales literature from Studebaker. This is a Baker electric ad. Baker was a pretty prominent maker of electric vehicles in the early 20th century. And then Studebaker, obviously, was a big part of that as well. So pros and cons, right? And some of these are still the case today, right? Electric vehicles are quiet. There's no smell or noxious pollutants that you might get from gas-powered cars. They're relatively easy to operate, and there's fewer moving parts. There's no gears to shift, things like that. Cons, they're fairly heavy because of the batteries. They're relatively slow to charge compared to electric vehicles today, and they have limited power and range. And when we say range, I mean, that's still, I think, a conversation topic today. We have a lot of people worried, we call it range anxiety. But back then, I mean, if you could get 40 miles on a charge, that was pretty good. And today they're talking about 400, so. All right, so next is steam. Has anybody in here ever heard of a steam-powered vehicle? A few of you? Oh, good, okay. This was really interesting for me. I didn't know a lot about these, but they were a big deal back in the early 1900s. They made a big part of the automobile market. And so again, the pros here, I have a few photos I can bring up here as well. They have more torque, right? So that leads to faster acceleration. They have a heavier load capacity. They probably didn't care at the time, but they are better for the environment. So you have to imagine it's basically a boiler, right? And once the boiler builds up pressure, it would power the engine. You'd have to, again, that would take a while, so you'd have to plan out your day in advance. But some cons, right? Poor fuel economy, and it takes up time, like I mentioned, to build up pressure in the boiler. So here's a couple of different photos of steam-powered cars. At first glance, you may not notice a huge difference between these and some other gas-powered cars, but if you flip open the hood, there's enough valves and whatnot in there for you to recognize that it's not a regular car. This photo is kind of interesting. On the bottom, this is a early steam-powered car at the rim of the Grand Canyon. I believe it's 1907 or 08. So, oh, this is one too. Between 1899 and 1905, you may have heard of Stanley Steamer. That comes from somewhere. There was a company called Stanley that made steam-powered cars, and their cars outsold all gas-powered cars and were second only to the electric cars of the Columbia Company. So they were very popular. I don't know the connection to the modern carpet cleaning company, but I'll have to look that up. So the battle of these motive forces, now we're getting to gasoline, right? So the internal combustion engine. The pro here is very important, right? They are faster and they do have better range than electric or early steam-powered cars. The cons, though, are also very important. They're very dangerous to start, require a crank. Many of you have probably seen images or early video footage taken of this. You could break your arm or injure some part of your body trying to start a gas-powered car. There's complicated gear shifting, again, noxious pollutants, and there are a lot more moving parts than in electric cars. So this is the Studebaker Museum's 1904 Model C, just right upstairs on display, and then another Studebaker EMF 30 here on the bottom. So, all right, so I want to spend just a couple minutes on this illustration because it's pretty fascinating to me. So this is from a magazine called the Automobile Review, you'll see up here, and Automobile News from 1903. So at first glance, you're like, cool, there's 15 cars on here. But we actually start breaking it down. And we have the bottom, these are 3 different steam-powered cars in 3 different companies. We have 3 different electric vehicles. And at the top are 3 different gasoline cars. And they're kind of a mishmash here in the middle. this is one page of this magazine, right? So depending on what your needs were and how much you could afford to spend, you know, you had a lot of options, I guess. And I'm going to call out two other things really quick to show you. So this is, I mentioned the Columbia company. This is the Columbia Coupe. It's a little worn off and kind of hard to read, but I think it's $3,250, so $3,250. What's fascinating about this is if you look up here, it has a seat for a chauffeur, and the chauffeur would have been driving the vehicle with this lever here, right? He'll connect it to the motor. So, you know, that's, again, it's an expensive body style. It's got a seat for a chauffeur, $3,200. You have the Studebaker trap electric vehicle here for $950. So two very different electric vehicles at two very different price points. Again, this one you would drive yourself, and this would have been chauffeur driven. So, and you'll see a lot of that in the 1903, 1904. They can't let go of some of those chauffeur powered cars, and that says a lot about sort of class and gender at the time as well. So, oops. Let's give that a second to catch up. All right, so let's come back to Studebaker here and other manufacturers. So I took the title from this ad, so automobiles for every purpose. So some of the earliest electric vehicles of any importance besides your crackpots who were out there kind of experimenting in the late 19th century are cabs, right? And so New York City especially had like a couple of fleets of several hundred electric cabs. And you can see, I think it was I have to look it up, I can't remember, the New York Electric Vehicle Company maybe. But they're lined up on this city street here. And so, yeah, you would have a driver, and then there's a section in the back for your passengers. And they were really popular. I was reading a story in a book about the history of electric vehicles that said people at the New York, was it Union Station, were waiting for cabs outside after they deboarded their train. And people would wait hours just to take a ride in one of these electric cabs rather than take a horse and carriage. So there you go. They were very popular. There were a couple of reasons why they didn't last: some financial mismanagement. There was a major fire that destroyed one of the fleets in New York City in the early 20th century. But again, this kind of kick-started people being familiar with seeing these vehicles on the streets. And companies like Studebaker and others also built commercial vehicles, right? Like that first one I showed you all with the elephant. You know, that was a promotional image, obviously. But Studebaker made a whole line of commercial vehicles. This is from 1906. So there's 5 different models of this particular electric wagon, ranging from about $4,200 to down to $2,300, depending on how much you needed to move different stake trucks. So this one down here, again, passenger cars are what we're probably more familiar with. This is a Studebaker electric Victoria Phaeton, one of the more higher end models at the time. And what I love about Studebaker's electrics and other companies is, I mean, very clearly rooted in their sort of horse-drawn heritage, you know, down to the carriage lamps and all the different trim on there. So, all right, so I want to spend just a second looking again at some of the ads, because this tells you a lot about the era. And so we have 2 electric ads and then one for the Ford Model T, which I'll get to in just a second. So this first one is for Baker Electrics. And so this is very common for early 20th century electric vehicles. They're advertising to sort of the upper echelon. Again, they were typically more expensive than other models. And so you can see the aristocrats of motordom. Usually, you know, these are high society ladies getting into this vehicle. You know, they were marketed as very easy to drive. Like anyone could do it, even kids or women, which is terribly gendered for us today. But that was literally how the advertising, you know, came across. And so you see a lot of that. Again, Baker and others like Studebaker using women and children and other things. Similar, this is another from Milburn Light Electric. This is a little bit later, but again, same sort of motif here, right? Kind of using that sort of imagery to sell their cars. And then here's one, again, from Ford Model T, so this is about 1908, 1909. We're going to get to this in just a second, but it's a different sort of advertising strategy. It tended to use less, it doesn't extol how easy it is to drive, but how it's affordable and that, you know, even your chauffeur is going to love it, right? So just very different advertising strategies. We'll give that a second to switch over as well. All right, so where could you buy one of these, right? Just like today, I mean, there were dealerships, there were outfitters in major cities, fewer than there would have been today, obviously, but again, cities like New York and Chicago had these sales offices. I outlined the Studebaker dealership in Chicago here, but there's others. Oh, it's really hard to read down there right now, but again, you could pop into one of these outfitters, one of these dealerships and talk with a salesperson about their cars. I call out the John Wanamaker department store in New York City because they sold Studebaker electrics. According to something I read, that they sold a 15-foot charging cord with your purchase, so that's handy. And you could use a home charging unit as well. It's called a rectifier. We're going to have one on display in the exhibit Patrick mentioned upstairs. It looks very terrifying to use, but again, these would have been available for purchase to home charge your electric car. And it's worth noting that some manufacturers, they did maintain full-service garages around major cities with charging facilities that you could pay a monthly fee or pay per charge. So I think that's my next slide. Oh, okay, we'll talk more about charging. So again, two different options for you here. This one on the right is a mercury arc rectifier. If that's not a turn of the century sort of industrial term, I don't know what is. So it's complicated, but suffice it to say it used mercury vapor to change alternating current to direct current for you to charge your car. And so that's what this bulb up here does, right? And so this would have been around I believe it's 1907. These would have been fairly typical, these arc rectifiers. And then later on, this is from 1922. We have this particular charger upstairs on display from the Henry Ford. This is a much smaller unit, much more portable, so you could have, again, charged your Detroit Electric Coupe from your house. So I think this is pretty interesting too. So on the right, this is a map of electric car charging stations in Chicago. This is from August of 1916, so a little bit later. So this outlines every major neighborhood of the city and where you could go charge your vehicle. So you can see there's dozens of different options to do that. I also like this bit here. It says Commonwealth Edison Company's substations are equipped for emergency electric vehicle charging. So you could go up to one of these substations and literally plug in your car and you could charge it directly from the substation. Then this is another, again, kind of a typical example of a charging garage with these mercury arc rectifiers out of Frankenstein's laboratory over here on the left. So, and like I said, sometimes there were fleet vehicles that would charge in these things. There were, you know, any number of people could pull into these garages and charge their car. So. All right, so it wasn't an easy sell too early on. I mean, electrics were competing with gas and with steam, and so there were a lot of these competitions, these road races and rallies early on. You may have heard of the Glidden Cup and others. Extremely dangerous races for the drivers, but again, proving the product. And so this image on the left here is from 1900. This is Andrew Riker. He was an early proponent of electric cars, so he built a race car. This is at Springfield, Long Island, at their racetrack, and he won this race. It was one of the first automobile races in U.S. history, and he won in an electric car, which is kind of cool. The year after, in 1901, that vehicle we have on display upstairs. So it's currently the oldest vehicle in the building from 1901. That also won a land speed record. I think it was 57 miles an hour he reached it on the track at Long Island, which is pretty good for 1901. So you can see all the spectators here kind of oohing and eyeing Riker. It's a terribly dangerous vehicle. You should go look at it. And then on the right here, this is a trophy in our collection. We have a nice collection of trophies that Studebaker vehicles have won across the years. So this is from, it's maybe hard for you guys to see, but it is first prize from the Indianapolis that's hard, I can't see that. Automobile Association, I think, for a drifting contest on March 1st, 1911, won by a Studebaker electric coupe. I don't know what a drifting contest is, but we won, so that's great. So that's kind of neat. There is another one we have on display as part of the exhibit from 1903. That's the earliest trophy we know of that was won by a Studebaker automobile from 1903. All right, so this I think is kind of neat. This is an incomplete list of EV manufacturers in 1907. So obviously I put Studebaker up here at the top. But we had, I mean, this, like I said, this is not complete. This is a snapshot in time. Some of you may have heard of Pope or Pope Waverly, the electric vehicle company. I mentioned the Columbia vehicle. Some of these you've probably never heard of. I hadn't heard of them until we did the research. So there were dozens and dozens of companies making electric cars. Some more successful than others. But again, this is a piece of sales literature from, I think about 1908, I want to say. There is it this one? No, okay, it's not this one, it must be a different one, but I have a Studebaker on a different image. But again, 4 very different types of vehicles that you could purchase based on your needs. So, and I should say too, a lot of these places were based out of Chicago, but also a little bit Indianapolis, but also Ohio and Pennsylvania. There was quite a bit. So, all right. So let's talk about Studebakers. So this image I love. This is J.M. Studebaker and some of his executives on the roof of the plant. You can see they're kind of high up here. This is a wooden sort of test track that lined the top of the plant. And so this is, again, an early Studebaker electric. They're taking it for a spin. I assume they all survived this perilous journey on the roof. But so just a few different Studebaker models here. So again, you'll notice a lot of the names have their roots in buggies and carriages that preceded them. So here's a Studebaker Stanhope. All right, I mentioned the trap. This is a much lighter weight vehicle. It would have been like a little 2-seater, right? Yeah, this is an electric. This is the same one I showed you earlier, the Victoria Phaeton with the top up. But if you wanted to, you could put it down. A runabout, so similar, a little bit smaller than the Phaeton. And then a special high-speed electric Stanhope. I don't know how fast this particular vehicle got, but I don't think I mentioned this, but when we talk about speed and a little bit about range, top speed for most of these electrics would have been around 20 miles an hour if you were really pushing it. And that was, again, probably at the peak of the electric sort of period around 1908, 1909. So. And a lot of these, too, I didn't have an image to show you guys this, but most models would have had the battery stored either in the front or the back or both. And like I said, usually lead acid. They're big, heavy guys. There are usually many, many trays of them all stacked in these giant batteries. All right, and there's an electric coupe. We actually have a coupe in our collection. It's in 1911, and that's also on display in the exhibit. Yeah. So this would have protected you from the elements, which is kind of neat. These windows rolled into the body of the vehicle. So you can see down here too. This one is probably the best illustration. You can see the chain here, the motor. Westinghouse supplied a lot of the motors for Studebaker and others. And like I said, that was pretty common to have those either 1 or 2 motors installed to move it. All right. Here's another one of those express wagons. Again, very similar to what we looked at before with the top and side curtains. All right, so just a few numbers for us here. Studebaker produced electric vehicles from 1902 to 1912, so about 10 years. I will say they introduced their first gas-powered cars in 1904. And so they started experimenting with electrics in the late 1800s, 1898, 99. Worked with other firms who had more experience building early automobiles to actually get these first models produced. And then again, enter the gasoline market in 1904. So they made both gasoline and electrics for several years. So total they produced 1,841, which is not bad. And the cost, like I said, they wildly varied. We looked at that trap that was around $950, but roughly around $1,000 to about $2,000, $2,500. Which, if you equate that to it says 1907 in 2022 dollars, that you can kind of see the pricing there. So not unaffordable, but when the average American worker at the time was maybe making $700 a year, it's a lot of money. So you can kind of see why some people still preferred using horses or just their feet or public transportation for a long time. So top speed, again, would have been about 20, 25 if you're really pushing it. Some later models could get up to like 70 or 75 miles on a single charge. It was more common to be like about 40 or 50 miles. And I should mention, this is an important caveat, this is on flat roads in a city, right? If you're traveling out of town and it's hilly or on rough roads, or this is the early 1900s, there weren't many roads outside of urban areas, or good roads, I should say, improved roads. You're not going to get that kind of mileage, and you wouldn't want to be stuck in the middle of nowhere in your electric car. Yeah, that's again, it varied wildly. But there was a company in a previous slide, was it Fritchley, I think? Their big thing was he created a battery to get up to 100 miles, which was unheard of at the time. So. And there's a Studebaker model 22A, which I think is that Victoria Phaeton up top there. So, all right, another great image to kind of bring this all back home. So this is Fifth Avenue, New York City, Easter 1900. So spot the automobile, it's right here. And then the same street, almost the same angle, 13 years later. And you can't see any horses. So just to kind of give you a sense of how quickly this transition happened. And you can imagine, again, cities coping with the fact that they're moving from an infrastructure that's entirely horse-drawn to this would have been a big challenge and came with a lot of people that got hurt and died. But it was a big transition. So, all right, so that moves us kind of into this third part. What happened? Why aren't we all driving electrics today, right? So we'll get into the single biggest reason is this. Does anyone know what this is? It's the Model T, right? So Model T debuted in 1908. This was the first nail in the coffin, but arguably the biggest one. Henry Ford introduced the assembly line process, right? Dropped the price of a car to less than $1,000. We can probably all sympathize if you're wanting to buy a new car but can't afford it. $1,000 or $900 is a lot better than $2,500 at the time. So that was a big thing. Here's a picture from Library of Congress of the assembly line and them putting some pieces together. The second important, I guess, nail in the coffin here is the introduction of the electric self-starter in 1912. So that hand cranking was sort of the biggest drawback to early gasoline-powered cars. If you didn't have to break your arm, why would you? And so the introduction of this electric self-starter to cars like to Ford and other companies making gasoline-powered cars was a big deal. And also just improvements to the gasoline engine. The muffler was a really big, helpful technology that reduced some of the noise and vibration associated with early gasoline-powered cars. And just as we learned more about how to, make the gasoline engine safer, it became a lot more popular. So you can see just some stats for you. The Ford Model T, initially an inline four-cylinder engine, which produced 20 horsepower for a top speed of 42 miles an hour. Which would have been cruising at the time, 42. So And take 20 horsepower versus usually 3 to 5, let's say, for early electrics. So this is another big part of it. Obviously, gas requires lots of petroleum. So early 1900s, there's some great movies and documentaries made on this, but the discovery of some of these huge petroleum reserves in places like Texas and Oklahoma drove down the price of gasoline, because initially gasoline was seen as kind of a useless byproduct until it was used in cars. An interesting fact, kind of side note, about the Model T is that it ran on gasoline but could have used ethanol and other types of fuel to run. It was not relegated to just gasoline, which was, I suppose, a pro there. So this is Spindletop in 1901. So we also have the expansion of gas stations, of fueling stations across the country. So as cars are able to go farther and faster using gasoline, you have the infrastructure kind of popping up to support that technology. And so we have gas stations popping up along highways and smaller towns, garages and maintenance facilities built to support gasoline-powered cars. All right, so again, I mentioned kind of these cars going faster, going farther. And we have improved roads by the 1920s, right? So we have better travel times. So we need vehicles that can go farther, that can make it to these distances. We see the Federal Aid Road Act of 1916 and the Federal Highway Act of 1921. And then again, the rise in popularity of automobile touring mirrored this expansion of the US road system. So I think I have a picture of, here's a Studebaker Light 6. I believe this is from right around this time, like the teens. But you can see I love it because in the background here, this is a Lincoln Highway symbol. So people are, again, traveling faster and farther in gas-powered cars. So I love this graphic. I put this together for you. It's simplified, but I'll kind of give you a quick rundown here. So in 1900, we see 40% of all cars are steam-powered that are sold, 38 are electric, and 22 are gas-powered cars. Again, this is 1900. By 1914, it's roughly 98% steam and gasoline. I couldn't break this down. I couldn't find the numbers to kind of break out the steam portion. I can't imagine it's very much. So I would say at least 90% of all new cars sold in 1914 are gas-powered cars. And this is actually less than 2%, it's like 1.6%. So, all right. So, suffice it to say, the electric car didn't do very well, right? It had a golden age, if you will, around late 1900s, 1912 maybe. People thought it was the wave of the future, and in a lot of ways it was, but the technology kind of stagnated. I didn't really mention this, but like we looked at Edison, a pioneer in battery technology and obviously automotive and other technologies. He worked on trying to improve the battery for years and made some headway, but they just couldn't quite get the battery light enough and energy efficient or energy dense enough to compete with gas-powered cars. I mean, that's what it comes down to. And so that's how you see, again, a lot of these things working against the electric car. And companies by the 19-teens like Milburn and Detroit Electric, who were still making these cars, they pulled out all the stops, right? I mean, they tried to introduce hybrid vehicles. Most of you probably heard of hybrid vehicles. But back in the 19-teens, I mean, this was a new concept, but trying to combine the best of electricity, but with the best of gasoline engines. That didn't really work out. There were advertising blitzes to kind of maybe try to discredit the benefits of gas-powered cars and really get people into these electrics. Again, all this, like, there were mergers, there was a lot going on, but these companies eventually almost all folded by the 1920s. There was only just a handful making electric cars into the 1930s. By that point, the gas-powered car was dominant, so it was kind of a relic of the past, if you will. So here we are 100 years later. That's a long time. We've lived with sort of an infrastructure for gas-powered cars for most of our lives here. I wanted to show you guys this graph. So this I took from Bloomberg. It's a couple years old here, but I'm not going to cover this in too much depth, at this talk. But the rise of electric cars, really started again here in the late 90s. And we see the slow rise as the technology has improved and more automakers are getting on board. So these are, again, the projected annual sales and the cumulative sales for electric cars. We're right here. It's a little bit off, I think, of this projection, because again, this goes back to 2014 or 15. But if this projection holds true, which I think it might, all total automobile sales by 2040, 35% will be electric cars, which, again, based on what we're seeing, is entirely possible. I think it's going to depend largely on cost, right? If we can get the cost down to where they're really competitive, and in some ways they are already, but really competitive with your average gas-powered sedan, I think that will see a real jump. And then charging as well, right? The charging infrastructure is a big part of that, which we talk more about in the exhibit upstairs. So, in the last couple slides here I have are just to show you guys, I mean, I love looking at these turn-of-the-century photos compared to some of the newer vehicles coming out now. It's fascinating to see kind of how the technology has progressed. These are all using lithium-ion batteries or some derivation of that. We have Rivian up here, this is the Tesla Model 3, the Ford Mach-E, the Ford Lightning truck, which a lot of people are very interested on because there aren't really many electric trucks yet. And then Hyundai has their own electric car. So at this point, most automakers have skin in this game. They're pouring a lot of money into developing EV technologies. And so I'm pretty interested to see where this goes in the next few years.